All right, let's get underway. Welcome everyone to another Massachusetts Peace Action webinar. This webinar specifically is sponsored by the Middle East Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action. Today we're going to examine what's going on with the Iran nuclear deal, a little bit of background. The JCPOA, colloquially known as the Iran nuclear deal, is a priority for Massachusetts Peace Action and for the entire Peace Action network. We view it as one of the greatest achievements of the Obama administration, a deal that was working, that was really taking us away from a path to conflict between the United States and Iran, and really making the entire region more peaceful. Of course, as we all know, President Donald Trump very recklessly pulled out unilaterally from the Iran nuclear deal. And as a direct result of that, brought us to the brink of war with Iran. We really got lucky there that it didn't end up with a shooting war between the United States and Iran. So right now, we are trying to put pressure on the Biden administration to really follow through with his own campaign promises, and that is specifically to rejoin the JCPOA as negotiated and without preconditions, to take us off the brink and put us back on a path toward peace and good relations between the United States and Iran. And today we are very, very lucky to be talking again with a key expert on this issue, Dr. Assal Rad, who's a senior research fellow with NIAC Action. That's the National Iranian American Council. They work closely on this issue. Just a little bit of background on Dr. Rad. She graduated with a PhD in Middle Eastern history from the University of California, Irvine. And she's been working with NIAC since 2019, actually in a volunteer capacity since 2018. And she has written for Newsweek, The Independent, The National Interest, and Responsible Statecraft. So we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Assal Rad. And I will bring you up on screen and just allow you to introduce yourself really quick to everyone.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me again, for everybody who's joining us today. I think Brian gave a very generous introduction. Really, my concern outside of like a professional capacity, I'll say, is that I've been an anti-war activist basically my entire life. I was an undergraduate student when 9/11 happened and when we began the war on terror. So really, my political outlook of the United States and what our policies are were shaped by war. Right? Like I've spent most of my adult life, actually my entire adult life, with the US being at war. And so I hope that ultimately what we are trying to get at is a US policy that is more inward looking and helpful to our own population versus, essentially carrying out fruitless wars.
Yeah, I have to say I had a very similar experience. Also have spent my entire adult life with the United States at war. Definitely the attacks of 9/11, 2001 were very, very formative, I think, for our generation. But as much as the wars that we have seen have been, incredibly destructive, everything that I have heard from experts is that a war between the United States and Iran would be completely catastrophic. I heard one expert, Colin Powell's former chief of staff, say that a war between Iran and the United States would make the Iraq war look like child's play, which is really saying something. What's your take on that? Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the state that Iran is in as a nation state currently compared to where, say, the state of Iraq was in 2003 or, say, Afghanistan in 2001, they're very different situations. And not only is Iran a different state than those states, but the United States of today is a different state than the United States of 20 years ago, right? Having gone through decades of war. And I say that, it's funny that we say it that way, as if we weren't at war before that. We have been, right? Like we basically we're always at war in some capacity or another, but to have this sort of like direct combat troops and things like that on the ground versus training other militaries to carry out different stages and theaters of war. We are not in the same situation that we were in 20 years ago, mostly because at least in a post 9/11 world, there was some form of justification to say, okay, there's a reason why we are carrying out X, Y, and Z strategies. Now, that doesn't relate to Iraq, obviously, because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But in the case of Iran, and looking at it right now, if ultimately our issue with Iran is about the nuclear issue, we have a very clear resolution in front of us that does not require any kind of military intervention or war. And so it's very, very easy to avert that. But going into something like that with Iran, yes, I mean, it's a much larger population. It's a much more stable country. The government has a much further reach. The region has changed because of US interventions. And so they have further reach within that region, and you have more instability already in the region. So it's very difficult to predict these types of conflicts. But yes, I think it is reasonable to say that the Iraq war would pale in comparison to a war with Iran.
So given the risks and the rhetoric that came from now President Joe Biden when he was on the campaign trail, I think I can speak for a lot of people in the peace movement. When we say we're scratching our heads, we're wondering what the holdup is on this. We saw it as a very clear path to renewing this agreement. So now here we are in November. It's been 9 months more since Joe Biden has been president. What are we waiting for?
Well, before I answer that, actually, there was one thing that I wanted to mention, is that because we keep talking about Iran and the US not being at war, and we're not technically at war. But something to keep in mind is, for the ordinary Iranian, I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about ordinary everyday Iranians, millions of people, their current situation is akin to war. And the reason why is because economic sanctions, the sanctions that the United States, I mean, Iran is the most sanctioned country in the world. The sanctions that the United States has put on Iran, these blanket sanctions that amount to collective punishment of millions of innocent people, that is attacking their livelihoods, their way of life, their ability to provide food and medicines for their families. That is very much existing in a state of war. It has the similar devastating consequences for those people. And so I think it is important to point that out, that when we, from the United States perspective, talk about the fact that we're not at war, it's because we're not being affected by anything that's going on, right? Iran is not affecting us in the same way that we are affecting Iranians. And keeping that in mind, I mean, looking at the Biden administration, I think it's fair to say that many of his supporters, organizations, that's especially peace-oriented organizations, diplomacy-oriented organizations, who wanted to see the Biden administration reverse many failed Trump policies, but that included Trump's Iran policy, right? If you look back to the Trump administration, which it seems like the Biden administration wants to ignore ever took place, but if you look back at those 4 years, the central foreign policy issue of the Trump administration was, in fact, Iran. And so withdrawing from the deal, having this sort of escalating tensions, the idea of maximum pressure, that was the centerpiece of Trump's foreign policy. And so in terms of foreign policy, what I think Biden supporters wanted to see reversed was precisely that policy. And unfortunately, up until this moment, as we were having this conversation, from the Iranian perspective, there's little distinction between these two administrations. The frustration is in the fact that what his supporters expected was an early return to the deal. Let's clarify the fact that the United States is still not in the deal. And there's all this sort of like rhetoric about Iran returning to the deal. Iran never left the deal. Iran can return to compliance in the deal, but it is actually still a party to the deal. It's only the United States that is not a party to the deal. Everyone else remained inside of the confines of the deal. The reason why there was so much hope that the Biden administration would take action early on is because there was an election coming in June in Iran. the Rouhani administration, that was the administration in power up until August of this year, was the engagement-friendly administration that really staked its claim on the JCPOA, on the Iran nuclear deal. And so there was the hope that that window of opportunity would be capitalized on by the Biden administration. And unfortunately, they didn't do that. I mean, to try and explain the reasoning behind why they didn't do it, and I'm sure there's all sorts of political reasons, but that's what it is ultimately. It's a political reason, right? It's the idea of the Biden administration coming in and wanting to focus domestically rather than on foreign policy. It's the idea that, Iran is sort of such a difficult subject to tackle within the United States because it is so vilified in a way that's so politicized that it's difficult to even have rational conversations when talking about Iran. And so there is, domestic political capital that you have to pay in order to do these things. I mean, the Biden administration has not really done anything terribly differently than the Trump administration. And yet Republicans are treating Biden like he's given concession after concession to Iran, which has not happened. So now imagine if they'd actually tried to return to the deal, the way that it would be framed, the narrative would be framed. But I think that it takes political courage, essentially, to be able to say, we're going to do the right thing. And the right thing is for us to return to the deal that we initiated, that we brought the international community together to actually bear fruit, which it did, right? We know that the deal worked. There's no question to this fact. The IAEA is an international body that is meant to monitor Iran's nuclear activities, Iran's nuclear program. And it did so. And every report said that they were complying with it. So it accomplished precisely what it was meant to accomplish. And so now, and these are not my words. These are the words, in fact, of Joe Biden. President Biden is the one who said in 2017 and 2018, in criticizing President Trump at the time, saying the deal is working and doing what it is meant to do. So I think we find ourselves in a place of frustration because now, of course, you have a more conservative administration in Iran that is less engagement friendly. And while they have signaled that they are still, they want the United States to return to the deal, to lift sanctions, and then they will return to full compliance as well, it is more difficult to maneuver with this new administration. And that's a window of opportunity that was lost by the choices that the Biden admin made.
And the last time that we spoke was, I believe, right after the Iranian election, and we were lamenting that the Biden administration had missed that very important window. And I think it's safe to say that they were fully aware that things could only get harder after the election. But you mentioned the connection with domestic politics, and I think you're really onto something there. I noted that even before Joe Biden took office, in the interim period between the election and his inauguration, 150 Democrats in the House wrote a letter in strong support of return to the JCPOA as negotiated and without preconditions, really echoing the words of now President Joe Biden on the campaign trail. Where's the support in Congress, even among members of the president's own party right now? And how is that affecting the hesitation to rejoin this deal?
Well, there are, even within the Democratic Party, there are sort of hawkish takes, especially on Iran. Like I said, Iran is I have argued that Iran is probably the most vilified state in the United States. And when you vilify a state, when you dehumanize a population, when you look at it in sort of these ideological terms versus logical terms, then the way that you look at it, it's colored with that lens, right? And so it's very easy to have a negative take on Iran. And so that exists clearly within the Republican Party, but also within the more centrist Democrats. And so that does exist. But of course, it was the Democrats who were criticizing Trump all along, right? So it is interesting to see how the same people treat the same issue when it is approached in the same manner. If you criticized a policy that Donald Trump had, and Joe Biden has the same policy, and you don't criticize it, then the criticism was never of the policy, it was of the person carrying it out. And so that's much more party politics than it is the policy itself. But still, President Biden has a great deal of support within his own party. They're just not vocal enough. I mean, I think that's ultimately why I think one of the concerns that I have is that because, during last year in 2020, and I know it seems like decades ago at this point, but when we were on the brink of war, when there was so much concern at these heightened tensions between the United States and Iran as a consequence of Trump's policies, a consequence of maximum pressure, there was a lot of concern about what would happen with Iran. And now, because that sort of heightened tension and the concerns that we're on the brink of war have subsided, now it's not really a topic that we're not very concerned with. But I think that that's naive, or I should say short-sighted. And the reason is because we're still on a path to conflict. As long as we're not returning to a diplomatic path, then we're on the opposite path, which is a path of conflict, right? So just because we're not currently in a dire situation, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take any action. In fact, logic dictates that this is when we take action, right? Because we want to prevent anything from happening. And so I think that you need more vocal support from those who, we know behind the scenes say, yeah, of course we support a return to the JCPOA. These are members of Congress. These are members of the House. These are senators who say they support this, but it's not, a top concern when you look at the sort of spectrum of political issues in the country currently.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I'm just going to share in the chat right now, and I'll be emailing this out to everyone who registered and also sharing it across our platforms. But if you click that, you can send a message both to the president and to your members of Congress, encouraging them to do just what Dr. Rad just told us, to be more vocal in their support of a return to the JCPOA. I want to take a question actually from the chat right now. This is from David Keppel. What influence are MBS and Israel exerting on Biden? Is Israel willing to strike Iran?
Well, in terms of Israel specifically, Israel has threatened to attack Iran for decades. I mean, this is like a continuous sort of thing. Not only has Israel claimed that Iran is, on the brink of a bomb for decades, but it's also threatened to attack Iran for decades. And these are not empty threats entirely. I don't want to say that they're just threatening it and nothing is happening. In fact, Israel has carried out systematic assassinations of Iranian scientists. Last year, one of which occurred last year, November of last year. In fact, after the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who's an Iranian nuclear scientist, the Iranian parliament passed a bill saying that Iran would actually expand its nuclear program. That was in a direct reaction to an Israeli crime. Let's be very clear that the assassination of scientists is illegal under international law. But of course, Israel is never censored, Israel is never rebuked, Israel is never held accountable for any of these things. And so those types of attacks continue. In response, in early April of this year, that's when the United States and Iran finally announced that they would return to negotiations in Vienna. Following that, right after that, there was an attack on an Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz, carried out by Israel. What was the Iranian response to that? The pledge to increase enrichment to 60%, right? So every time you see these attacks come from Israel, you see the Iranian reaction is to expand its program, because it's not terribly difficult to understand why, when you're being attacked, your response is to be defensive. Interestingly enough, the Biden administration did not censor Israel for its attack. It censored Iran for saying that they would increase enrichment to 60%. So the problem with this ongoing double standard in the way that we look at how countries abide by any types of international protocols or norms is that we allow, as long as we commit to double standards, then we're not really even-handed brokers. We're not really creating an atmosphere in which anybody should be held accountable to international law. As long as everybody is not being held accountable, then you give every other country an excuse not to. So Israel has constantly put pressure on the United States against the JCPOA. That's whether it was Netanyahu or now with Naftali Bennett. In fact, again, last month, Israel threatened to attack Iran, said that they would that they're allocating, I think, billions of dollars in funds for a strike on Iran. But what was most disconcerting is the idea that, Secretary of State Blinken would sit with Israel's foreign minister and talk about other options, a plan B. What is a plan B? I mean, there's barely anything left to sanction, right? We have used our sanctions and economic power really as much as we can. And yet, then what becomes a plan B? If it's a military plan, then this goes against everything that Americans want, the American populace wants, and everything that this US administration has claimed, right? That we want to end endless wars. I mean, that's a great catchphrase, right? And that's why Republicans and Democrats use it. But ultimately, what are we doing in order to attain that goal? And sort of playing into Israel's aggressive language, I think is quite dangerous. In terms of Saudi Arabia, something that's quite interesting is while, Saudi was one of the countries that was also against diplomacy between the United States and Iran, after the inauguration of the Biden administration, and especially now under this new administration in Iran, you're seeing dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They are having their own dialogues. They're having their own sort of diplomatic channels opening up. And that's a good thing, right? Diplomacy across the board is a good thing because we want to see solutions to problems that are through engagement rather than violence and war. And so I think there's a little bit of a shift on the regional front. But of course, Israel maintains this sort of negative attitude towards the JCPOA. Something to keep in mind, and I'll just add this last part, is that when I say Israel, and this is including any state, when you say the US, when you say Iran, none of these states are monoliths, right? So it's not like everyone in the state thinks the way that the powers to be are carrying things out. In fact, within Israeli intelligence and military, there are people who have come out to say, actually, the JCPOA was working. Actually, it was a good thing. So it's not a universally thought thing, even in the state of Israel. But it is a question of what the actual policies that are carried out by those states are. And it's thus far, in the case of Israel, it has been to sabotage not only Iran's civilian nuclear program, but diplomacy itself.
And I have to say that I'm left scratching my head on that issue as well, because it seems to me that Israel is one of the countries that stands to benefit the most from diplomatic relations with Iran. That the risk of instability in the region is only greater if there's no diplomatic relationship between the United States and Iran. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't say, and we don't talk about this enough in the United States, that there's only one nuclear power in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And that power is Israel. I think this fits right into what you were saying about double standards.
Right, which we don't acknowledge, by the way.
Yeah. It's never been publicly acknowledged. I've never even heard a reporter ask a president of the United States about Israel's possession of nuclear weapons, which is really sort of an open secret and has been for decades now.
It's actually, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to say it's funny that you bring that up, because the logical expansion of the JCPOA, right, like modeling the idea of non-proliferation, is that this would expand for the entire region, right? That's what we would want, as in terms of global security and non-proliferation efforts. We would want more and more states to submit to monitoring if they have nuclear programs, and to pledge not to make weapons, right? So many of the states in the Middle East, including Iran, would support a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. It is, in fact, Israel and the United States who reject it. So think about what that even means. If ultimately our goal is to, demilitarize the region, is non-proliferation, is to make sure that nobody has nuclear weapons, then why are we protecting one nation's ability to have nuclear weapons? I mean, we have to be able to have conversations that are honest and understanding why other parties react the way that they do. They do because nobody wants to give their neighbor a military edge. right? Nobody wants to agree to that. We don't agree to that. We certainly don't agree to that. We don't agree to giving anybody a military edge, which is why, we have the gigantic military budget that we have, which is why we have the largest military in the world. So to think that other states would be okay with things that we are not okay with ourselves, it defies logic.
I agree. And just to let folks in the audience know, we are going to get to Q&A really soon. You can use the raise hand function under reactions at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand as Wade has done. I'm going to be calling on you shortly, Wade. Wade always has great questions. But I wanted to continue with this discussion of the double standard. One of these phrases that we always hear is about Iran's behavior in the region. You never hear about the United States and our behavior in the Middle East, which is not even in the hemisphere that we're in. But often, even from Democrats, I've heard people shift the discussion from the JCPOA and its terms, which focus on the nuclear program, and they're talking about ballistic missiles. They're talking about drones. They're talking about proxy forces in other countries in the region. What's the best argument against that when people try and change the subject?
It's sort of pointing out obvious hypocrisies. I don't know if that's a good argument, but it points out why those arguments fall flat always, right? I mean, you brought up drones. So here's a perfect example. The most recent sanctions put on Iran by the Biden administration were on its drone program. Now, let's just unpack the irony of the situation. The United States is sanctioning Iran because of its drone program. The US drone program has systematically killed civilians. In fact, this happened about a month ago, right? It was in August, I believe, the drone attack that killed, 10 Afghan civilians, including 7 children. An internal investigation by the Pentagon said nothing happened. There was no crime committed. We jail whistleblowers, right? Daniel Hale is currently in jail because specifically he exposed the criminality of the US drone program. So to sanction Iran based on a program that we regularly use, which could be considered war crimes, right? When you're killing civilians, civilian population, that is generally understood as a war crime. But we don't apply the same standards, right? Our actions are seen as benevolent on their face just because we are the ones carrying them out. As long as we're carrying out the action, it's okay because we're the ones carrying it out. Now, none of this is to say that Iran does not exhibit problematic behavior. Of course it does. And it does, and I cannot emphasize this enough, against its own population more than anyone else. More than anyone else, it's Iranian people who bear the brunt of any abuses that government lays out. And so none of that is to say that one party is not doing something that's bad. It's just that as long as we have these conversations that are just seeped in hypocrisy, we're not having real conversations. And we have, as Americans in the United States, a lot more control and influence over what we do than what anybody in another country does. That should be obvious. I mean, if we are truly out to address notions of democracy and human rights, then we should be starting at home. We are not immune to that. In fact, we carry out a great amount of violence throughout the world. And so, if you talk about, we always talk about the Middle East is armed to its teeth. Well, who's arming them? The US. The number one arms seller in the world is also the US. We are selling billions of dollars in arms to all of these different countries. So there's so many actions that we can take to curtail that kind of violence, but we don't do it. And so I think that when you start talking about, oh, but this state is doing this, I'm like, aren't we engaging in the same kind of doublespeak as the Iranian government itself, right? When the Iranian government doesn't want to take responsibility for their own abuses, what do? But look, in the United States, they do this, this, and this. We're doing the same thing. It's the same concept. We're just diverting attention to what somebody else is doing without actually taking responsibility for what we're doing. And I think that's the only logical step to take, is that we are responsible for our own actions before we're responsible for anybody else's.
And I just shared in the chat an article that we wrote about that airstrike in Afghanistan that you just mentioned, because I think that's an incredible example of the hypocrisy that we're talking about. That the U.S. government could say that no one is criminally liable for a strike that killed, I believe it was 7 children, and the target ended up being an aid worker for an NGO based in California, I believe, is the height of hypocrisy, and really shows how broken the system is. I just want to ask one more question before I pass it off to our audience, and that is about the negotiations that are going to restart at the end of this month. I'm curious about how they're going to be structured. I know in previous negotiations, Iranian negotiators and American negotiators were not actually sitting in the same room. Is that going to be different this time around? How optimistic are you about these talks that are going to be renewed?
I would assume that they would continue in the same fashion, because the reason why there weren't direct negotiations between Iran and the United States is because, like I said, the US is not in the deal. The US is not a party to the deal. That's why the negotiations occur indirectly, and likely that's what it will continue to be on November 29th, which is when nuclear negotiations are supposed to resume. In terms of optimism, I mean, you could sort of go 50-50 in terms of optimism in the situation. I mean, you could see why why we can be pessimistic, but we can be optimistic because the solution is actually quite simple. As much as political commentary in DC likes to make everything sound so complex that it's impossible to happen, it isn't. And it's one of the ironies, actually, of the Trump administration, is that he basically showed that, right? Like, when he wanted to do something, he just did it. He was just like, oh, I'm executive order, I'm going to do this. And it was done. So every sanction that was placed on Iran was placed by a signature. That means the same sanctions can be lifted by a signature. There's all sorts of ways of trying to make it sound more complicated than it is. But for the US to return to compliance, it has to lift sanctions, right? This is not a concession. It's so important to emphasize this. Iran, I think it was last week, there were like 3 demands that they made. One was that the US admit that it was wrong, that sanctions be lifted, and that there's a guarantee that no future administration would be able to leave the deal. Now, 2 of those are very simple. The US is in the wrong. I mean, you don't have to. The thing is the Biden administration doesn't have to say this administration was in the wrong, but that doesn't mean the United States was not in the wrong. Whether or not they like it, Donald Trump was the president of the United States. Joe Biden himself, Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, all of the members of this administration criticized Trump and Pompeo for years, saying that it was a failed policy, saying that the JCPOA was an agreement that was working. And so to have criticized them when they were in power, and now that you are the new administration, to not admit the exact same thing is a bit odd, right? It's very simple. Yes, of course, the US is in the wrong. The US is the one that reimposed sanctions, violating the deal when Iran was in compliance. To the second point, which is sanctions should be lifted. Well, of course, sanctions should be lifted. The United States will not be in compliance unless sanctions are lifted. That's all that means. It's not a concession. It's not a special thing that's happening. It is literally the US complying with what it promised in the deal, was to lift sanctions. In terms of the third, which is the idea that the Biden administration can guarantee that future administrations don't leave the deal, it can't really do that, right? That's just a reality that we have to, that not just we, but Iran has to deal with as well. And it's the same thing for both sides, right? Like, what guarantees do we have that every administration in the future in Iran will comply by the deal as well? Now, the difference is, for Iran, there are clear mechanisms within the deal that punish Iran if it violates the deal, right? Sanctions, snapback, there's a way within the deal to say that Iran must be held accountable. There's no way to hold anybody else accountable. Now, that's something that can be discussed if you want to discuss how to strengthen the deal. But in terms of just returning to the deal as it is, the US would have to actually return to the deal, lift sanctions, and then Iran has said now repeatedly within this administration and the previous one that they would return to full compliance if the US lifted sanctions. So yeah, I mean, in terms of optimism, if Biden just upholds his own promise to return to the deal, this should not be as complicated as we've made it. We should have been able to do this back in February, to be completely honest. Here we are, to your point, all these months later, and during this period of time, Iran continues to expand its program, and ordinary Iranians continue to suffer under sanctions in a pandemic, no less.
And I think that's a key point. And our position here at Mass Peace Action and Peace Action more broadly is that sanctions are warfare. They kill people. Most often, the average, working people. We're talking about the elderly. We're talking about women and children. We've heard so many examples of people who have family in Iran who can't get their cancer medication, folks who are in wheelchairs who don't need to be because they can't get the medical devices that would allow them to walk. Sanctions are brutal. They're often portrayed as an alternative to war, but that is absolutely untrue. And it's also an assault on our system of government and our constitution. You were saying that Iran is the most sanctioned country in the world. I recently did some research on this, and some of those sanctions go back to the Carter administration. And these are emergencies that now go back 40 years or more. It's absolutely ridiculous. So I just wanted to address the importance of sanctions, but I want to bring Wade in. Wade, I know you've been waiting for a long time. Sorry. I can go ahead and ask your question if you're ready.
Yeah, I would like to speak to is that when people look at what Biden's not doing or why he's not doing it, if they stand back and look at it, the reason for that is this, that how Iran and China are sutured together. What people have to realize is this, that the oil and the energy that's coming from Iran is fueling China. If you're trying to fight China, China has become, as we know now, is a reserve currency and is fully convertible and has Saudi Arabia moving from the US dollar over into doing trades, international trade in the yuan. If you attack what fuels the growth of China, this is what people are not putting the pieces together. This is why you see the fervor against Iran, because without Iran, China, it will be held up in its international trade. This is why Biden, when he came to office, he didn't go right over. As he got into office, they told him, look, if we're going against China, we have to fight what fuels them. And with it, and also when you go back and look at that also, you have to look at why is MBS switched over? Because MBS wants to become another UAE. But in order to become another UAE, he's going to have to make concessions to go with Iran and agree to this in the GCC nations, because Saudi Arabia now is running out of oil. For every 10 barrels they're pumping up, they're getting about maybe 10 of it's water. So they have to have another revenue. And their other revenues they're looking for, this is what you see and why you see them doing the mega cities and them building the new solar farms there, because this is going to be another source of energy where they can make money.
Let's let Dr. Rad get in here. We're incredibly concerned about the potential for conflict between the United States and China here at Peace Action. How do these great power competitions affect U.S.-Iran relations?
Well, I think there's two ways of sort of looking at interstate conflicts, right? This sort of international conflicts. There is either looking at it through internationalism, which theoretically is how we're supposed to be looking at it, right? In the wake of World War II, we were supposed to create an international community where, the age of empire theoretically was supposed to end. Of course, it didn't, right? We are an empire. It's sort of silly to not acknowledge that fact. And that's why the way that we talk is like an empire, right? Like this entire conversation now, when you talk about, the competition between China and the United States and how does Iran play into, that's the conversation of empires, right? That's competing empires. Of course, no one competes with the United States currently, but the concern is, well, let's make sure that we keep this sort of imperial edge that we have throughout the world. So there's two ways of looking at conflicts. If you look at it through an international lens, the idea is, and why we created internationalism was to say there are issues that affect everybody, right? They transcend borders, which are made up, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. But there are issues such as nuclear proliferation or climate change, which affect everybody in the same way. It has nothing to do with whatever nation state you belong to. And so to tackle those issues, to avoid, conflicts, to stop having wars, that's why we created ideas like sovereignty and borders, and we should respect this and we should respect that. Unfortunately, we don't do any of that. So if you do look at it from the lens of empires, either way you look at it, for the US, it is beneficial to have some form of engagement and resolution with Iran. If you look at it through an international lens, non-proliferation is a key issue. This is a way to resolve and build on that issue to ensure that Iran cannot acquire a nuclear weapon, and to expand from there in further non-proliferation goals. Iran just recently said that if sanctions are lifted, that they would ratify the Paris Climate Accord. Climate cooperation, if you look at it through an international lens, it is better to cooperate. If you look at it through regional conflicts, the war in Yemen, with the fact that Iran has influence in certain places would benefit the United States again in trying to alleviate these conflicts if there was more engagement. So when you look at it through that lens, this is positive. Now let's look at it through the empire lens, just to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. Even from an empire lens, it makes more sense to engage. The reason being precisely what we were just talking about. There was, when Iran and China announced this sort of like 25-year deal, everybody in the US freaked out. They were like, oh, why? Look, Iran is pivoting east. It's like, well, of course Iran is pivoting east. They tried to pivot west and you sanctioned them to death. So it doesn't, our own policies are creating these other alliances, right? When you exert your power as an empire, you invite other people to do the same thing. You're inviting other countries to be like, well, how do we figure out a way to weaken that empire? Because again, nobody is going to sit there and just be dominated. That's not the nature. That's, not the history of anything in human history has pointed to the fact that anybody's just going to sit there and submit constantly. So you're always and that's why you have this history of empires competing. So really, however you look at it, it makes sense to engage. It makes sense to resolve this issue. It makes sense to, whether someone is an adversary or a friend, that is the entire point of diplomacy. It's very, very easy to get along with your friends. It's not as easy to get along with your adversaries. But to avoid conflicts, that's why we have diplomacy. So I have a difficult time looking at it from any perspective where it doesn't make sense to engage.
And I tend to agree, of course. I want to bring in my colleague, Paul Shannon now for a question. Paul, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Thank you, Assal. Really appreciate you spending this time with us. I can't imagine how simple it would have been for Biden to get into the agreement right from the get-go, and how much he has boxed himself in now if he really did want to get into the agreement, making it so much more complicated now, both in terms of its negotiating partner and US foreign policy establishment. So I'm assuming that the agreement is dead, and would like to look at some of the implications of that. To me, the real danger and the reason that we're talking with Israel the way we are is that, and the reason that Israel is so against the agreement is really because Israel wants to go to war with Iran. When I say that, I mean, a massive air campaign to destroy not only the Iranian nuclear assets, but also the country itself. I mean, I just see the handwriting on the wall for that. I wondered what your reaction is. This is why, to me, is the only thing that makes sense of why Israel is so against this, and why the U.S. is caving into to that policy that Israel, as well as obviously a lot of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, wants. And then just to tag something on at the end, Iran has constantly said that it does not want to develop a nuclear weapon. Do you believe that that is the policy? I mean, there's nothing they've done that would indicate that it's not. Thank you.
I mean, so the scenario that you painted is certainly a possibility. I hate the idea of trying to predict how things will happen, because the reality of everything is that it's unpredictable, right? Any one factor, especially in war, when you look at the history of wars, it's sort of what has often sparked a war is not what you think would have sparked a war. So it's hard to anticipate what's going to happen, but you can consider various sort of reasonable scenarios. And I do unfortunately think that the one that you painted is a possible scenario. Now, what I will say is that this is not the first time Israel has threatened these things, right? Israel has been threatening, like I said, for decades. Israel was against the JCPOA in 2015, but yet we got there, right? We did actually finally get there, despite the very strong sort of rhetoric and pressure coming from Israel. And to a certain extent, I think we as like people looking at the situation are in a better position. The reason being, if you look back in 2015, the whole idea, the discourse behind it was, you can't trust Iran. Iran's never going to abide by this agreement. Iran's never going to negotiate with the United States. Iran's never going to do this. It's went on for a very long time. Of course, now we have actual evidence that none of that is true. Iran did negotiate with the United States. Iran did abide and comply by the agreement. And so I think we, those of us who are diplomacy oriented, are in a stronger position to say that, look, none of what you're saying is true. We know as a fact that it isn't, that they have complied, and there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't comply in the future. So I do think that right now it's open, right? It's a choice. And I emphasize this because I hope this is the pressure that we are putting on our administration. This is a choice that the Biden administration will make. And the impetus is on this administration to do so. Now, they're going to try to blame Iran. We're going to watch this unfold over and over again. They will try to blame Iran as much as possible. They would be in a much stronger position to blame Iran if they had returned to the deal and lifted sanctions. Then if Iran didn't comply, they would be correct in blaming Iran, right? Then you could actually be in a position where you said, well, we took action. We did what we were supposed to do. They didn't do it. But we're not in that position yet. So I like to stay optimistic that, because I know this as a fact, the options are available to us. We have defied, what Israel wants in the past, and we should be able to do so again. We're in a stronger position to do so now, knowing that Iran complied with the deal previously. And so there's really nothing stopping this administration from doing it besides its own choices. And therefore, whatever comes will be their responsibility. In terms of the last part of the question about Iran saying that they don't want nuclear weapons, they have repeatedly said this. There have been, sort of arguments made on religious grounds where they've said, it's in Islam, it's haram to have a weapon that's so destructive. That sounds great. And so far, they have not pursued a weapon, but there's nothing to say that calculus can't change. In reality, all states, as much as they speak ideologically, all states act with the sort of rationality that they are trying to survive as a state themselves. And so what concerns me the most is that our actions are changing the calculus of Iran, or could, I should say. It's not that it's happening, but that it could. And you can see, as someone who's just sort of like watching these things from the outside, why it's possible that they would change that calculus. Because if you were in their position, if we were in their position, if we complied by something, and got no benefit from it, then it creates this alternative of, well, then how do we sort of get them off our backs kind of mentality? And so I hope that we do not take steps that ultimately make them change their calculus. I don't think we can bet on the fact that they simply never will, pursue a nuclear weapon on religious grounds. I don't think that that's, a reasonable way of looking at it. This is a rational acting state, and so it will act in order to survive. And if the calculus changes to, well, maybe this is what we need to do to survive, then I do think that that's also a possibility that we have to be able to entertain. If we're having, again, honest sort of conversations, I don't think we can say that that's not a possibility. Again, it is a possibility, but they haven't, right? If they wanted to pursue that route, then they've had ample opportunity to do so. Instead, Iran is a signatory to the NPT, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has settled on an agreement that allowed for monitoring of its nuclear program in a fashion that no other state has submitted to. So it's also incredibly unfair to use that sort of frame of they want a nuclear weapon. Well, there's no evidence that points to that. All the evidence points to the fact that they want a civilian nuclear program and they want sanctions lifted.
Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Paul, for your question. Michael, I think we're going to have to give you the last question. Michael, if you can unmute yourself, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about something that I'm starting to kind of become aware of, and I don't know how accurate I am on this, but there seem to be three major ideological blocs in the Middle East. So there's an Islamist bloc that I think now Turkey, Qatar, and a few other countries, including Gaza Strip, are part of. And I guess Iran's part of that Islamist. Then there's the people that used to buy weapons from the Soviet Union, Iraq and Syria and all the secular states. And then there's a royalist bloc, which is kind of Saudi Arabia and the UAE or the Emirates. And it seems like Israel's tied in with that, but that the US has gone on the offensive against the Islamist and the secular nations. And I don't know if I'm just putting something there or if there is something to this idea that we've definitely taken an ideological alignment against any Islamist country and any secular country.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that the sort of notion of those blocks are much more complex, right? And in every single state, you'll find every single category. So nobody cleanly falls into any of those categories. But in terms of how the US ideologically approaches, ultimately, they don't care about any of that, right? I mean, we have supported, in the 1980s, we supported jihadism in Afghanistan, right? Like we don't have an issue with that. We support monarchy where we think monarchy is fine. In the case of Saudi Arabia, we'll support secular states, even if they're authoritarian, in the case of something like Egypt. So there's our ideology is not being driven by those sort of like block way of thinking. I mean, if you go back to the Cold War in the Soviet Union, you get more of that, right? Because you had these two ideological frames and the US entire intention was to defeat communism, right? That argument can be made. But of course, again, to your point about the Islamist part, they had no problem capitalizing on that as long as it was fighting against the sort of communist bloc. I still think that is ultimately the strongest ideological opposition the United States takes to anything where you have sort of like socialist or communist type ideas. That's where we still ideologically are bound. And I think that's bound more to an economic system that we have than anything else. But in terms of, how we approach things ideologically, I do think that we have some ideological inclinations. And that's what I meant when I said earlier something about, the sort of double standards in which we deal with things. If you look at the case of Iran and Israel, for example, the amount of examples of hypocrisy are too difficult there's a laundry list, right? And that is ideological in and of itself. The fact that you blindly support one state, no matter what it does, even when it defies your own policy objectives, even when it defies the values that you espouse, but you still blindly support it no matter what. I mean, we actually use that language, right? The ironclad commitment to Israel, the fact that we say that aid to Israel cannot be conditional. What does it mean to make something unconditional? That is insane, right? To say it's unconditional, what does that mean? That means, so what if Israel attacks the US? Is it still unconditional? Or do we have any condition in which we're like, no, we won't provide aid? So that is where I would see more of an ideological approach in how we do things. And then it's the reverse in the case of Iran, right? Even when Iran is complying with the deal that we create, we still villainize them and say we're leaving the deal. So there is that kind of ideological bent, but overall, I don't think that we're approaching our sort of policies in the region in that kind of block manner.
Thanks for that. And just to get back to something that you said earlier about how insane some of our policies in the Middle East are, just the notion that you can continue to simultaneously arm, invade, occupy, and sanction a region and expect it to be more peaceful as a result is insanity. But this idea of American exceptionalism, which I think is in contrast to that, is so powerful that it's just the mountain of evidence. It's difficult to overcome it. Go ahead.
Just to add one thing, it's difficult to overcome it when we're so dishonest about the way that we talk about it. And so you see, yesterday was Veterans Day, and you see a headline from New York Times that says, Biden observes his first Veterans Day with no war underway. That sentence is insane. It's propaganda on its face. I mean, if there's no war underway, why do we have 800 military bases around the world? Why did we increase the Pentagon budget if there's no war underway? What is bombing countries then? Is that no longer war then?
Other countries. Yeah, it's very Orwellian.
So it's the level to which we can talk about things there's no other word for it, in a dishonest manner that makes it difficult to amend any of these policies, because we actually, you have the New York Times saying that there's no more war.
So you said that you think it's about a 50-50 shot with these negotiations coming up at the end of the month. That's a coin flip, and that tells me that folks can have some real influence over whether this goes through or not. It's like you said, it's 50-50. So what would you like to see from supporters, from the grassroots folks who are supporters of a return to the JCPOA? What do we need to be doing right now to influence that so it's 51-49 to get back into the deal?
At the beginning of this month, actually, NIAC, our organization, worked on a letter that many organizations signed, including your own, including Mass Peace Action, that's urging the Biden administration to alleviate some of the humanitarian impact of sanctions on Iran during COVID, to help Iran with combating COVID, which accomplishes multiple tasks. Number one, it obviously helps in the global efforts to combat the pandemic, which is a goal that the Biden administration has laid out. It's something that Joe Biden criticized President Trump on when in April of 2020, he specifically talked about sanctions on Iran during COVID. And he pointed out himself that despite humanitarian exemptions, that US sanctions are impeding the flow of humanitarian and essential goods. So this is something that again, Biden himself has stated. The idea of urging them to take humanitarian steps is that we have nothing to lose. We have only to gain, right? If we're helping a country combat COVID-19, then we only actually have something to gain. In doing so, in this goodwill gesture, if you want to call it that, we also create an atmosphere where diplomacy is more palatable, right? Where you can actually finally see a distinction from the Iranian side between the Trump and the Biden administration. So I think that is one of the most important things to push for, the multiple reasons that I just laid out, is to urge this administration to take immediate steps to address sanctions that are impeding the flow of essential goods into Iran during the pandemic. And I think that opens up a little bit of space for for the Iranian side to see that there's a difference between these two administrations and hopefully open the space for diplomacy.
Thank you so much for joining us. I just put in the chat again, and we'll send to everyone's email a way that you can quickly send a message to both your members of Congress and to the administration to tell them to do what Dr. Rad just said. And also, if you hold for just 1 minute, that's the White House comment line, 202-456-1111. I recommend that everybody give them a call. Do it right now while it's on your mind. Give them a call and tell them that you support a return to the JCPOA as promised during the campaign, and tell them that it's a voting issue for you, because this is an absolutely critical policy decision. And frankly, there's no excuse for not returning to the Iran nuclear deal. There's no excuse for this continuation of Donald Trump's policy, and that's what it is. I'll give you the last word. How can people follow your work? Is there anything that we should be reading right now? Take it away. The floor is yours.
Well, really, I just want to say thank you again for giving me this platform to speak, for everybody who's attending and listening. Like I said, I tend to try and stay optimistic, and basically my optimism comes from things like this, right? The optimism comes from the fact that there is a way. I truly believe, and I could be considered naive for saying this, but I truly believe that there is a way of pressuring and holding accountable our officials. There's a lot of work to be done in that arena, and it goes beyond Iran and it goes beyond our foreign policy. I mean, but we have to keep doing the work. And so, thank you to everyone who's here. I see that you are all doing the work by being here. And you can follow me on Twitter at Assal Rad, at ASSALRAD. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for spending so much time with us and bringing us up to speed. I'd like to thank the audience as well. No matter whether you're watching this here on Zoom or on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook even. We couldn't do this without an audience. And just to remind you that Mass Peace Action is truly a grassroots organization. So we depend on volunteers, people who donate their time, people who donate funds. If you can't donate your time, we would appreciate a couple of dollars too. We're always going to keep our webinars free, but we really do require the support of people just like you. That's what we have going for us. It's not billions of dollars in defense money. It's the people who by and large want peace, and they're sick and tired of war. So I'll just last thing, I'll put my email in the chat. If you're interested in getting more involved, drop me a line. I would love to hear from you, love to get you plugged in. Everyone's welcome at our Middle East working group, where this program came out of. If you would like to help produce these programs, you can do it. It's easy. So please reach out, get involved. Don't be a spectator. And just once again, Dr. Rad, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you, and everybody take action.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.